Welcome to the Rise Method podcast, where we make fitness information available to everyone. I'm Steve. Let's jump in.
Hey folks, Steve here. Welcome back to the Rise Method podcast. In today's episode, we're flying solo again, and we're going to be answering 3 questions. So it's a little bit around pain, a little bit around injuries today, and a little bit about toning the inner thigh, but we'll get to that in a moment. So jumping right into it, team, the first question here says, hey Steve, I've done a couple of challenges in the past. However, I've recently injured myself, a prolapsed disc pushing on a nerve, and still unable to lift weights. Would just running be okay for the challenge? Would running just be okay for the challenge? Okay, so firstly, we can answer this question in a few different ways, but answering the main part of the question is running okay for the challenge? Yeah, of course, absolutely. The challenge is all about physical activity, getting you into the gym, getting you doing exercise, doing activities. So running, of course, is a great form of activities. Now, for many people, running is a higher impact activity and the cause of pains such as lower back pain. So for example, for me, there's probably been a small handful of times where I've experienced significant lower back pain. Most of those times is when I've gone to peak in a deadlift. So I would go to do a max effort in a deadlift, or I'm in a period where I'm doing max effort deadlifts. And what that means is that I might be getting ready for a competition, like a powerlifting event, or I'm just being silly. I'm just being really dumb in my training, usually training like with a buddy or something. We're trying to push each other to the limits, and I'll be doing something like close to my max effort for multiple reps, not just on one day, but on multiple days across multiple weeks. So that's usually when I kind of injure myself. And then what tends to happen is over the course of, let's say, a month, 2 or 3 times a week, I'll be doing, above 90% of my max, throw in a couple of nights where I didn't sleep very well, I'm stressed out. One particular time I was at uni and I had exams coming up and I was deadlifting, and that's when I really kind of hurt my back. But other than that, the other time that I've hurt my lower back, meaning that it was quite painful, was when I started running. So my story was I ruptured my ACL in my teens. I was 18, year 12 high school, and I was playing lacrosse, of all things, in high school. And I was named captain of lacrosse. It was really exciting. First game of year 12, and I went to change direction. The defender that was on me fell and landed on the side of my leg, and there was a really loud pop. It was like a shotgun, bang, went off, and 10 out of 10, probably 11 out of 10 pain in my knee ballooned up, and I was really naive about it. I just kind of bandaged it up, walked on it, and basically managed it myself, managed my pain myself, learned how to work through the tissues of my leg whenever I had a flare up. And it was a few years until I got this really deep burning sensation in my knee. I went and got it checked out properly, went on an MRI, ruptured ACL, meniscus, I was in my early 20s, probably when I first, a few years prior to starting with the Max's challenge back in the day, and I had a total knee reconstruction. So ACL reconstruction, meniscus cleanup. And a few months after the surgery, I got cleared to start running. And at the time I was a weightlifter, and I thought, well, I never really run, and I got cleared to start running, so I might as well give it a go. So I started running, and I was telling my professor at uni about this, and he's like, oh yeah, I don't think it's a good idea to do any long distance events. And I was a little bit like, screw you. So what I did was I went and ran a 5K, and this is maybe a week after I got cleared to start running. So mind you, I didn't do a lot of physical activity. I was mainly walking, maybe doing some light exercises, my rehab, all that type of stuff. And I said, screw this, I'm gonna start running. So I started running. I went from 0 to 5K within a week, and that wasn't fun. So I had quite a lot of lower back pain, quite a lot of hip pain, quite a lot of like shin splint-like pain from one bout of running. So this is a long-winded way of saying that, for me, in my decade plus years of training since I was a young teenager, handful of times I've had lower back pain. Some of those times is when I was really maxing out on my lifts, and the other time was when I started running. So if you had a true disc protrusion, which is the way that she described it, which is a prolapsed disc, a prolapse disc, and it's kind of in stages. So we start off with maybe a bit of disc degeneration, maybe changing in the annular fibers on the outside, where the nucleus inside starts pushing up against the annulus fibrosus. That's kind of like the first stage, and the prolapse is when the inside kind of pushes out a little bit more, and then we have extrusion where it's pushing out even further. Then we've got this fancy word called, it sounds like a horse, sequestration. So I always remember to like equine is sequestration. Anyway, that means when it's actually like proper out. Anyway, the point is prolapse is maybe that next level up. If we had a true disc prolapse in the lumbar spine and it was pushing on the lower, a nerve into the lower leg, running probably isn't a great idea. Mainly because of the randomness of running. Each step, the pavement, the floor is a little bit different. Each step, each stride is a little bit different, applying a lot of loads in different areas of the body. Plus, it's really high impact. So when we are running, we're putting something like 7 or 8 times our body weight into each leg, and that force gets transmitted up our body. So running can be a really high impact and might not be the first level of rehabilitation in a true disc prolapse in the lower back. Now, what would be the very first level of rehab is actually putting resistance on the body in a controlled way through lifting weights. So the best form of rehab for a lower back injury is to lift weights where we're managing the load. So if a physio, osteo, chiro, doctor says don't lift weights, man, you should go see another healthcare professional, because the best way to manage those symptoms is to lift weights. Now, in day-to-day life, we're lifting weights. We are doing the washing, we're lifting up the washing basket, we're going shopping, we're carrying the shopping bags, we're bending over, we're picking up toys on the floor if we have kids, we're picking up our toddler if we have kids, we're picking up our shoes off the ground, we're carrying things and moving things around the house, we're doing activities where we are carrying things, so we're lifting weights. So it doesn't make sense that we just completely avoid lifting weights because of the resistance. It's all about how we manage that load. So let's use an example of a squat. Okay, if you had a true disc prolapse where you was pinching on a nerve, and mechanically that's very rare that the disc actually pushes and touches the nerve. Normally it's like chemical irritation. So pinching the nerve, I'm just poking at the language here, but you may not choose to do like a loaded barbell back squat with your previous working weight if you've had a disc, back pain. For me, when I would injure my lower back, when I was lifting much higher loads than I was able to manage, when I was going through my rehab, I wouldn't deadlift with the weight that I injured my back with. I scaled it back down all the way almost to the barbell. So I was able to do some activity so that I can get some movement through my body, strengthen some of the muscles, and it was fine within a couple of weeks. So what I'm getting at is the best way to manage a lower back injury and to get a confirmed prolapse of a disc. One, is difficult. You would need something like an MRI to confirm that. And then 2, it's not the cause of pain. And we see that in studies where we get people like you and I, so let's say me in my 30s, we get people like me, no pain right now, so asymptomatic, no symptoms, and put me in an MRI and see what they find. And they found that, testing my numbers, but it was a really high proportion. Over 50% of people in their 30s had some sort of disc degeneration, some sort of disruption in their lumbar spine, or a disc bulge in more simple words. So what that means is that over 60% of people in my demographic, in my 30s, had some sort of change in their lumbar spine, but had no pain. Similarly, as we get higher in ages, there was a higher prevalence of it. And it was somewhere in the 50s or 60s, it was somewhere like 80% of folks had some sort of disc degeneration, some sort of disc change, but they had no pain. This was found in other areas of the body, like in the shoulder, like labral tears, so the labrum in the shoulder, hip, labrum in the hip. So tears in the labrums of the hips and the shoulders, no pain. FAI, femoral acetabular impingement, no pain. Rotator cuff degeneration and tears in the shoulders, no pain. So it's hard to say that if you get a scan and this is the presentation, that is the cause of the pain. It's all about how we manage our pain and manage the load. So if we look at the 2 extremes or 2 examples, we have lifting weights and running. We could run slower, maybe take shorter strides, so there's less impact, but we've still got the body weight going through, the jolting of running. And that could be a lot of load that we're not ready for. Whereas if we're lifting weights, we can regress the exercise and regress it until a point that is manageable and tolerable. So use the example of a squat. As I was saying, you might not choose to do a barbell back squat. You might choose to do, let's say, a dumbbell version, a little bit easier than a barbell, maybe a front squat position. And if that's too much, we do a body weight squat. If that's too much, do a body weight squat onto a chair, like you do when you go to the toilet or sit into a car or hop into bed or, sit on the couch, or body weight onto a chair. If that's too much, you hold onto a pole or a wall or a squat rack to give you support. If that's too much, you maybe have someone helping you to give you assistance. So we can regress it further and further to a point where it's an activity of daily living, or it's even less of an activity of daily living, an even regressed version. So main takeaway here is that the best way to approach rehab is to actually lift some weights, and maybe not in the same lens as what you think. I'm going to go to the gym and push for maxes. It might be a regressed version to apply resistance on the body. Running might not be the best option. Of course, it can be an option if you love running. Go for it. But when we rationalize it, it might not be the most strategic way to manage lower back pain, manage a true prolapse, and manage the symptoms so that we can get you back to where you were as quickly as we can so that you can enjoy the things that you love doing. Good. Next question here, we're going to talk about some spot reduction. So the question is, hi Steve, I'm wanting exercises to tone the inside of my thighs. Any recommendations? Thank you in advance. So again, when we look at this question, we can start making assumptions and then of course answer the actual true question. So the true question is, I'm wanting exercises to tone the inside of my thighs. Any recommendations? Firstly, defining what toned means. Toned is when we have an increased resting tension in the muscle. So let's say myself, training for over a decade, my muscles have an element of tension when I'm at rest. So there is a sense of tone in the muscle. Whereas, there's some people in my family who are well into their 60s and 70s who've never really exercised before. Their muscles may not have the same resting tone as mine because they don't train. So what happens is when we are training, we see an increase in nervous system activity. So the nerves are keeping the muscle at a bit of resting tone. There is an increase in muscle cellular size. So there's a little bit more compact. So the muscle has a little bit more of that resting tone, and of course more strength. So we have more control in those fine motor units. So the muscles can be at a higher potentiation, meaning that they can contract quicker and have a little bit more of tightness to it. So if we are wanting to tone a muscle, we need to strengthen the muscle, right? We need to build muscle in that area so that it has an increased resting tone. When we talk about the inside of the thigh, we're mainly talking about the adductors, and adductors is ADD, adductor, right? Where that's the inside of the thigh, or more simply something like the groin muscles. And the groin starts really high up in the pelvis and goes all the way down to the inside of the knee. So to target those areas, there are some isolation exercises, and you've probably seen them before, that awkward machine in the gym where you're trying to close your legs, you sit down and it opens your legs and you try to close it. So there's exercises like that to target the adductors. There's some sport-specific adductor exercises. You might see some sports folks like football, AFL players, where they might do what's called the Copenhagen plank, like Denmark, where they would place, let's say, they'll go into like a side plank position, maybe left elbow down on the ground, and they would put their right foot up on a bench or the right knee up on a bench, so that they need to do like a little bit of a adductor, pushing that knee down to work the inside of the groin, isolation light exercise. So we can target it specifically. However, the adductors or the groin is used in lots of activities, especially when we are single leg. So we can use the adductors a lot in things like lunges and split squats. We also use the adductors whenever the knee is bending. So similar when we're working the quadriceps, the adductors can work, especially if we start to open up the legs. So things like squats, if you had a wider stance with a squat or a toe turned out position with a squat, the adductors can get a lot of stimulus, as well as like a sumo stance. So even sumo deadlifts can work a lot of the adductors. So we can certainly target areas in training. Now, after questioning this question a little bit more, we found out that this individual wanted to target the inner thigh to lose some body fat in the inner thigh, because they described their thighs as tree trunks. Now, I could describe my thighs as tree trunks, and so does a lot of my family. Genetically, we have larger thighs. And even when I was to a point where I was bodybuilding, quite lean, I would have the six pack, I'd have striations in my pecs, I'd have striations in my quads, but I still carried some body fat around my thighs. And that was like the last space for body fat to be lost, was around my thighs. So the first thing we need to appreciate is that genetically, some of us are more likely to hold body fat around places like our hips and thighs. And that kind of skews a little bit more towards women. So women, we tend to hold more body fat around our hips and thighs, whereas guys, we tend to hold more body fat around our midsection. And that's where we get these really stereotypical body shapes of the dad bod, bit of a belly, or the maybe truck driver, a bit of a belly, but they might have, skinny legs, skinny arms. So they're not holding a lot of body fat around their arms and legs, holding a lot of body fat around their midsection. Then in contrast, you might have that stereotypical women who have like a narrow waist, but then larger hips and thighs. And they might be carrying some body fat around their hips and thighs, mainly to do with reproduction, to protect the hips and thighs and the uterus. And you may find that that's one of the last places that you lose body fat. Now, we can't really spot reduce. So we can't target the inner thighs and lose body fat specifically in the inner thighs. And yeah, there is some literature that suggests that maybe you lose a little bit more body fat in the areas that you're working out, but not to a significant extent. So if you are losing body fat, if you were to train, let's say your arms, because you want to try to lose some body fat around your arms, you might lose an extra, 1% of body fat around your arms if you're trying to lose your body fat in general. So maybe you might lose a little bit, but it's not very significant. Of course, the biggest way to lose body fat is to be in an energy deficit. And when we are in an energy deficit, we lose body fat across our whole body. And if we're focusing on the inner thighs and every day we're looking at the inner thighs, you may be looking at the wrong areas where you're losing body fat around your midsection, your arm and your back and everything, but you might be focusing on just one small spot, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing we need to appreciate. Finally, a great strategy to focus on is to spot enhance. So you may be looking at your inner thighs and thinking, okay, how am I going to lose body fat in my inner thigh? What you could focus on is to build muscle around the inner thigh, the thigh itself, the quadricep, the hamstring, the whole leg, so that the leg gets a well-rounded shape, even though you have some body fat around your legs. So a separate example was, once upon a time, I used to have lots of love handle problems. So, the love handles around just maybe above the hips. And I was really self-conscious about that. This is before I started training. So I was self-conscious about the love handles that I had. And I would always try to hide it and always be really awkward about it. I used to wear really baggy t-shirts to try to hide it. That didn't become a problem as I started training. And now, even if I am carrying a little bit more body fat, I don't have an issue with any love handles. And the reason why is because I've developed a shape in my body. So by training things like my lats, the back muscle that creates that V shape, by training things like my lats, I've created this bit of an illusion where my upper back gets nice and wide, and then my midsection is actually kind of narrow. Even though I have still some love handles, they're not visible to the same extent because I have muscle around my back. So in a way, you can continue to have the same amount of body fat on places like your legs, but if you had larger thigh muscles, yeah, okay, the leg might look slightly bigger, but by having more muscle, more tone in the muscle, by having a well-rounded and well-shaped legs, we look past the body fat. We don't even notice the body fat because of the shape that is there. So you can certainly spot enhance, and that might be a mindset shift where we are trying to spot reduce, but instead of trying to reduce and make it less, we focus on making it more, making it greater, making improvements. So if you're sitting there focusing, Steve, I want to tone up my legs, I want to lose fat in my inner thigh, I want to lose fat around my arms because I'm sick of the saggy arms, what's it called, the tuck shop lady arms, however we label things, poor tuck shop ladies. We can enhance those areas by making them stronger, building muscle in those areas, and we may not need to focus on primarily losing body fat in those areas. All right. Last question here, back to a little bit of pain, discomfort. It goes, hi, Steve. I really felt my hip flexors during the lunges front was worse. I ended up dropping the weights on the last set. Do you think it's because they are tight? Okay, so we're primarily talking about lunges or maybe a split squat position, single leg exercise, and we're feeling it in the hip flexors, so hip related pain. And it was worse on the front. So it just says during lunges, front was worse. So we don't know if it's the front leg or front like lunge, like a forward lunge. Is it because they're tight is the question. Okay, answer the question directly. Yeah, it could be because the hip flexors are tight, maybe. It might be because the hip flexors are weak, maybe. Or it could be because the hip flexors are the solution to a problem. Okay, now we break down those three ideas. So the hip flexors being tight, yeah, okay, if you're sitting down for longer periods of time, some of those muscles can become a little bit shorter in a way, being more contracted. So when you go into like a lunge position, you are doing a bit of like a hip flexor stretch. So those muscles are doing lots of stretching. And of course, that stretching might be above our pain tolerance level, so it becomes painful. So yeah, of course, it could be the hip flexors doing that. That's number one. Number two, it could be because they're weak. So when we're doing a lunge, the back leg is actually working quite a bit. So if you, depending on, of course, how you're doing the lunge, you may be doing a little bit of like a leg extension with the back leg to stand up, rather than like a leg press with the front leg to stand up. So you may be doing lots of hip flexor strengthening exercises with that back leg. So of course, it's fatiguing and you're feeling maybe a bit of discomfort, a bit of pain. So that can certainly be happening. The final thing is that the hip flexor could be your solution to a problem. So if you go to lunge, you need an element of stability in your hips, and primarily it comes from larger muscles like the glutes and muscles on the side like the glute medius supporting the hips. But if those muscles aren't strong enough or being utilized to their advantage, the hip flexor might go, hey, don't worry guys, I've got this job, and they start to contract and support that lunging position. Because the lunge is a little bit unstable because you're in a split position, whereas if you have 2 feet on the ground, more stable. So we can see some increases in hip flexor engagement when we're doing things like a lunge. Now, what can you do? So firstly, you might need to work on some hip mobility, primarily into internal rotation and external rotation. And we could do that with movements like the 90-90 position, or some people call it a hip box, where you're sitting on the ground, you bend your knees, both of them, and you would rest one leg out in front, just like you would do maybe like a glute stretch, and you would rest the other leg towards like kind of behind you. So you're making like 90 degrees with both legs, and one leg is in external rotation pointing outwards and the other leg is in internal rotation pointing inwards. And if you're unsure of this, you might want to just Google a 90-90 stretch or a hip box. And sometimes we lose that rotation element in our hips, and it might be worth strengthening that rotation element so that when you go to things like a lunge, the hip can move into places like extension, which we can only get there if we have internal rotation. And if we are able to extend, we are able to internally rotate, we are then able to use our glutes, and then the hip flexor pain dissipates. That, of course, can be a thing. The other issue that might be happening is that we may have an underlying thing like a FAI, femoral acetabular impingement, and that loosely spoke about it in the very first question about back pain, where it may be symptomatic, it may be painful, it may be painful when you're doing a lunge. And what FAI is the hip joint itself is kind of like a cup, and then the thigh bone is like the ball. So it's like a ball and socket joint, yeah? Now, sometimes the thigh bone is too big for the hip joint. So we call that a cam, meaning that the head of the femur is too big for the whole of the hip. Sometimes the whole of the hip is actually too small. So the thigh bone is a normal sized, and the hip socket is actually smaller. And we can compare like left and right. You might find like the right hip joint socket is smaller than the left. So that creates an impingement syndrome. And then sometimes there's a mixed, and that's probably the most common, is a mix of the thigh bone's a bit too big and then the hip bone's a little bit too small. Doesn't really matter what it is, because you can't really tell if it's one small, one's big. Just it doesn't fit very well. So it is normally self-managed, where you might need to reduce range of motion, because end ranges of motion can be painful because you're mechanically pinching things. And sometimes just you might be more sensitive to some tightness in things like the hips, where we get a smaller margin of error to get that pain. Whereas myself, I don't have FAI that I know of. So for me, if I am, let's say, a 5 out of 10 tight in my hips, no issues, no worries. Whereas if you have FAI, just a 2 out of 10 tight in your hips may cause that pain and discomfort, right? So you may have an underlying FAI where you may be pushing your hip into larger ranges of motion that you're not ready for. One example with a lunge is if you bend forward lots when you lunge, let it be forwards or backwards. If you really bend forward, you go into a really deep hip flexion. So where, your chest is getting close to your thigh, and that can cause a little bit of discomfort because literally like tissues are hitting each other in your hip. So you could still lean forward if you were trying to target your glutes by pushing the knee out to the side a little bit to create some space. So instead of going, straight forward with the hip, so that's pure hip flexion, you might add a little bit of abduction where you bring the hip out, the leg out slightly, so you can get some more range of motion there. Another solution might be that you just really try to keep that chest up. So when you're lunging, instead of like lunging forward and moving your body weight forward, you do a bit of a split squat where you are simply lowering the body weight down, right? So you're keeping the chest a little bit up. You may hold onto a pole or a wall just to help keep your chest upright. Alternatively, you might try to shorten the stride length or lengthen the stride length or open the stride up. So sometimes when we lunge, way we describe it is someone would lunge on like a tightrope. Imagine like you're walking on a tightrope and you go to a lunge. Really hard to control your balance because you're basically in a straight line. Whereas if you were to lunge on, let's say, like train tracks, so your feet are still, let's say, hip distance apart, you may find more balance and control. So there are some solutions that you can try, modify where your feet are, you might solve your problem. Modify your stride length, that might solve your problem. Regress the exercise, you might solve your problem. And maybe working on a little bit of hip mobility, as in hip internal external rotation, might solve the problem. I would recommend that you just reflect on your exercise execution. So film yourself doing a lunge and you might find something funky is going on. So if you compare left foot forward then your right foot forward, if you're only feeling it in your right leg, if you were to lunge with both legs and you just observe both styles of lunges, you might find that lunging in one direction, it just looks weird, it looks funky, it looks like you're kind of tripping a little bit, you're awkward, or maybe you're moving the body weight forward lots or moving the body weight backwards lots, versus the other side where you're not getting any pain, you're doing it differently. So that might be enough to kind of go, oh, okay, I was just being a little bit silly with my lunges, that's why I was causing this discomfort in my hips. Maybe the side that was uncomfortable, I make that look like the other side. Happy days. Other things to consider is an overall view. So if you are looking at your legs and let's say the right hip is painful, right hip flexor is painful, and then also on that right side, that you have tight calves, or you have a history of rolling your ankle or something, okay, you can start to piece two and two together. All right, why? It's a little bit of a coincidence that I get this right hip flexor thing and I always roll my right ankle. Is there a relation? Maybe. The other thing to consider, of course, is that the hip flexor is very close to the groin, especially when we're doing like a lunging position. And like I just mentioned in the previous question about targeting the inner thigh, if you are lunging, you might be using your inner thigh a lot, and you may not simply feel the difference between the hip flexor and the groin, and they're kind of one and the same. So you might be having a little bit of groin discomfort that is kind of presenting as, hip flexor. And that, of course, we can start looking at the ankle, we can start looking at the thoracic spine, so the rotation elements, we can start to break down, how your whole body is twisting. So we can go into really kind of deep rabbit holes around like physical therapy type stuff, but I'd recommend maybe modify your execution slightly, maybe work on hip internal, external rotation, and we can reassess once we give those things a try. So there you go, team. I hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. We've spoken a little bit about back injuries, we've spoken a little bit about targeting areas around the inner thigh, and we've spoken a little bit about pain. So injuries, inner thighs, and pain. How good. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.